Welcome back. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you today talking about leadership in an era of fluidity and transience. We're living in a world where things are changing so fast that obsolescence is no longer a theory, it's a reality, and it comes at us quite rapidly. And so crises change us as well. I'd like to focus on four primary things. Fluidity, that's defined as the quality of being fluid or unstable, a character of changeability. And then I'd like to share some steps in embracing fluidity that I learned in a major crisis. The third topic I'd like to talk with is transience. Transience is defined as the state or fact of limited endurance. It is the inevitable flow of transition and change. And lastly, I'd like to share some thoughts on meeting, mitigating, and facilitating the inevitable and planned transitions in our lives personally, professionally, and corporately. Years ago, I heard a song called "Everything Must Change." It was written by Bernard Aigner. I put the picture up because I kind of like his beard. Mine is like his. The lyrics to that song are kind of a dirge. Everything must change. Nothing stays the same. Everyone must change. No one and nothing stays the same. The young become the old and mysteries do unfold, because that's the way of time. Nothing and no one goes unchanged. There are not many things in life you can be sure of, except rain comes from the clouds, sun lights up the sky, and hummingbirds fly. Winter turns to spring, a wounded heart will heal, but never much too soon. So Bernard Aigner is talking about change, and we're living in an age where things are changing more rapidly than they ever have before. The idea that permanence is a thing that we can strive for is leaving us behind. The idea that a 20-year or 30-year career in one company is possible is less and less likely. Permanence is an illusion. We as chaplains need to realize that and help the leaders that we work with understand and prepare themselves for those changes. Leaders meet moments that often force radical and unrelenting change. And it creates a continuum of life. I like to call it the continuum of life before the boom and after the boom. Left of the boom, life is kind of bucolic, like walking along a pleasant stream. It's just like flow. We're in a professional flow of life. We're in a personal stream of comfort and security, and we are happy there. But more times than not, changes will occur. Our infants become toddlers. The toddlers become children. Those children become teens. And in many families, 13 begins the boom cycle. But then, boom isn't the end of the continuum. It does change the paradigms of life. But it isn't the end of the continuum. There is life right of the boom. I've had several boom experiences in my life, but I'd like to tell you about one that happened in September 2013. I was on my way to work at a brand new job, and we were preparing for a meeting. In a moment, before the meeting started at 8 o'clock, an event began to transpire that would cause my life to intersect dramatically because of these two men. Admiral Hilardis on the left was the commanding officer for the Naval Sea Systems Command headquartered in Washington, D.C. The man on the right is Aaron Alexis. He had worked for the Naval Sea Systems Command, and for reasons not fully explained, he became disenchanted, angry, and determined. He went on a 69-minute rampage inside the Naval Yard in the Humphreys building, and he killed 12 people and injured 8. By the end of the day, the world had changed. When I was dispatched to go down to the Navy Yard to see what I could do and to connect with the other chaplains who were there, that's what it looked like. A war zone in Washington, D.C. I was there about 32 minutes after the shooting started. It lasted for 69 minutes. Later in that evening, I met with Admiral Hilardes and several other leaders who were there in the building. 8 chaplains had gathered, and we were tasked to do the death notification calls on the family members of those who had fallen. It set up an arduous time, but I learned some things from the way Admiral Hilardes responded in that time of crisis. From the moment of the boom, he heard shots. He got up from his desk. He went to open his door. When he did, 3 of his security detail pounced upon him, dragged him to the floor, dragged him under his desk, and took defensive positions in case the shooter made it up into his office space. They stayed on top of him until they were assured that the threat had been eliminated. He couldn't use his cell phone. He said in a rehearsal of what had transpired and what he was thinking, that he felt like he needed to be doing something, but in that moment, he couldn't. There are 7 steps I'd like to share with you in dealing with boom experiences in your life. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as that day, but everybody has boom experiences, and almost immediately we react. We react to the circumstance of the boom. And that's normal, that's appropriate, and it's instinctive. Training helps. So figuring out what you might do in a certain circumstance is a good idea. Contingency planning is good. And grit, personal grit, that resiliency that will make you bounce back is essential to survival. You probably saw on the news that day that a person was wounded and they airlifted her via helicopter from the roof of the building to the hospital for care. I talked to her. Her story is public. Jennifer Bennett is her name. When we talked, it became apparent to me that she is a woman with grit and determination. She is a spiritual woman who had a morning devotion time with God that was part of her regular practice. She said that she had an inclination/conversation with God, that something dramatic and traumatic would happen during the day, but she would be okay. She met Aaron Alexis on a stairwell inside the Humphreys building in the Navy Yard. He was on one landing, she was on another. She was above him, trying to go to the roof. He looked at her, she looked at him. There were people who had gone up before her and she was getting ready to go, and he fired that shotgun. It hit her in the left shoulder. And the doctor said had she not been wearing the leather jacket that she had on, it might have ripped her shoulder from her body. The blast knocked her down. But I'm talking about grit. Jennifer Bennett didn't lose consciousness. In fact, she remembered what she had heard in the morning and said, "This is not going to take me out." So she got up, dragged herself up, and faced the shooter again and said, "I'm going to be all right. Are you?" He turned and ran down the steps. Grit in the face of tragedy, in the face of drama, in the face of trauma. She stood up. She was resilient. And grit is essential to survival personally, and not just in a physical crisis, but in a professional crisis. Being able to get up again, being able to see further than the immediate circumstance is one element of resiliency that's necessary in embracing the fluidity that happens in a boom situation. So the second step, or second phase, is rapid responses. First, you have reactions. Then you have to have considered responses that flow rapidly in order to create security or eliminate threat to the organization or individual. These are honed frequently by practicing and unannounced drills. The third step in embracing fluidity after the boom is being able to make critical assessments. And this is not just a one-of situation. Critical assessments have to flow in. As new information arises, you have to put that into the matrix of decision making, which we'll talk about later. And then based on those critical assessments, make new determinations. And then the fourth phase after critical assessment is figuring out how to employ crisis mitigation and deploy necessary assets and skill sets in order to address the crisis. And now, once you've mitigated the crisis, that's just the first step in managing the crisis, because you want to move from mitigation and management to resolution. So crisis management involves not just eliminating the risk, but resolving the issues and recreating after it. In order to recreate, you've got to participate in what is the sixth step, reflective assessment. That's when you ask, what happened? How did we respond to what happened? How effective was our response? And what do we do next and going forward? And that leads to the last step in embracing fluidity after the boom, and that is recovery and re-envisioning, or visioneering as I like to call it. When a boom happens and something explodes, it's unlikely that you'll be able to go back to things just as they were. So there needs to be intentional recovery, and then there needs to be the revisioning or the visioneering of what you want the life, the world, the experience to be going forward. So let's review. After the boom, fluidity requires recovery, revisioning, and mobility. Recovery, revisioning, and mobility. What do you do during the times? You reflect. You have to reflect upon what happened. And if there are losses involved, please take the time to grieve. It may be loss of a loved one, it may be loss of status, it may be loss, whatever. There are losses when change happens. Grieve appropriately. Honor the experiences that got you where you are. Honor the things and the people who helped you become who you are. But who you are now is not yet who you are to become. So in visioneering, you've got to ask yourself some questions. How did I get to be who I am? Who do I want to be or be like? How do I do that? And you do some backward planning toward creating the vision that you see and desire. And then rebuilding. Rebuilding your life after the boom simply is the act of restoration. The sequential act of recovering and rebuilding your reality and making it what your hopes are that it can be. In the process, you experience personal, professional, and corporate renewal. Someone said to me years ago, a bend in the road is not the end of the road unless you fail to make the turn. How do you best make turns in your life? Dealing with fluidity, dealing with transience, dealing with all of the ramifications of life. It helps to have a decision matrix. There are 6 steps in a decision matrix that I'd like to offer you, and you can find it on the website listed below. 6 steps, 6 questions, simple questions that you can ask yourself. What is my desired change? What do I know about where I am now and what I want? Third question, am I thinking straight about this issue? Fourth question, will I really take this chance? Will I take action on this opportunity? What is it that I'm deciding on? Because sometimes we can be in the fog about decision making. When you narrow it by that question, what is it that I am deciding about? It narrows the focus, crispens your choices, and increases the quality of the ensuing decision. And the last question is, what are the consequences if I make this decision, and do I care about those consequences? So those are 6 things on a decision-making matrix. I offer them to you in terms of visioneering your life, recovering from a boom, and creating a new standard and a new normal. Fluidity does things for us. It gives us a sense of impermanence, but it doesn't have to create insecurity. I have a slide up here with a Bosu ball and a core challenger. If you're familiar with the gym, you've probably seen these things. You know that if you're standing on a Bosu ball, that it's not going to be stable, that it's going to move left or right, front or back, and you have to adjust your balance. That's predicated upon your core. This other machine, the core challenger, does the same thing. It's used for planking. And if you're on that thing and you're trying to plank, normally if your elbows are on a flat floor, you just are in a static position. This thing moves you from side to side, up and down and back, and you control your balance solely by your core muscles. Similarly, the changes in our life and how we deal with them are determined by our core. Fluidity will create exhaustion, but that exhaustion will turn into endurance. The endurance will become resilience, and resilience prepares us for transience. That's that other topic I wanted to talk about before I close. Transience is in every dynamic of our lives. When I was young and CBs were common, my CB handle was Gypsy Man. I liked that handle because it reminded me of a song that was popular back then by the group War. You young folk and you very seriously spiritual folk probably were not exposed to that. I was none of those when I was young. But that song reminded me of the impermanence of my existence. In my childhood and early adulthood, I never lived anywhere longer than 3 years. Early in my ministry, I moved every 3rd year. That was professional transience. In my military career, I moved every 2 or 3 years. In this concept of professional transience, we have to know that we grow, we move laterally, or we're failing. Professional transience is something that we've got to get a grip on. Some of the other chaplains will talk a bit about that. But as it relates, I want to share 7 or 8 things with you about transience, personally or professionally. The first one is the life cycle awareness. We all have a life cycle. I can remember when I was 4 or 5 years old. I remember my first crush, my first kiss. I remember wedding day. I remember the birth of my children. I was thin, weighed 165 pounds when my first child was born. You can tell I don't weigh that anymore. That's because I'm advancing in the life cycle. I used to have an afro. I don't have it anymore. And my hair used to be dark. Now it's gray. That's life cycle awareness. There are professional transitions in our lives as well, and institutions have life cycles. It helps to be aware of that milieu as we place ourselves in our development pattern, in our lifestyles, in our professional experiences, and in our institutional relationships. The second dynamic is mission focus. Mission focus. That's required personally, corporately, and institutionally as well. It's built upon principles, policies, and practices. The third thing that's important in professional transience is vision and being driven by appropriate vision. Sometimes that's informed by corporate memory. Sometimes it's determined by the blending of personal and corporate visions, so that it's not just an individual vision that's driving a circumstance, but a shared vision that builds everybody into a better circumstance. The fourth thing is longevity. Martin Luther King said, longevity has its place. Like any man, he said, I want to live. But we have to understand that personally and corporately, momentum is an imperative. Being stuck for too long is counterproductive. Growth is paramount, and it's an essential in nature. Everything grows or it dies. How can you tell how your growth is progressing? A new phrase common now is key performance indicators. If you don't have any, you should create some for yourself. If you have employees or people that you supervise, you should have some key performance indicators for them as well. If you're a company and you're producing some kind of product or service, there should be some key performance indicators that let you know how well you're serving your market. And then, I mentioned it earlier, life cycle awareness, but there is a science to the life cycle in institutions. It's introduction, growth, maturity, saturation, and decline. Being able to assess where you are on that continuum is important. And then there's seasonal metrics. You know, the 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Well, there are those personal seasons and there are corporate seasons. We'll say more about that later. But Story Strathman said something that struck me when I read it. She said, if you try to prolong a season, the experience sours. You got to know where you are and when it's time to transition. And that brings me to the last point, succession planning. It is a leader's job to prepare leaders to do what he or she does, so that if you falter or fail, someone else is already prepared to step into your role. The best leaders are not afraid to build new leaders. They rejoice in the transitions of folk that they have prepared. I told you about the Navy Yard experience. My last day on active duty and the last act as a Navy chaplain that I did was do the prayer of dedication at the Humphreys building when it reopened after being restored after that horrible and fateful day. I had been their chaplain along with other duties since the day after that shooting occurred. I moved through the hallways, I got to know the people, I did some counseling, I did a lot of listening, I worked well with the folk, but it was time for a shift. It was a time of professional transience in my experience. After I said the Amen in that moment there, I went inside, I shook the Admiral's hand, I met my relief. He was a rabbi with a therapy dog. I got replaced by a therapy dog. But it's okay, because he had skills that I did not. And life goes on. The Navy Yard is doing well now. The Naval Sea Systems Command has recovered. They revisioned their future, and life is good for them, and life is good for me. Don't be afraid as your life goes forward to embrace the fluidity of your life's experience, your professional performance, and your life cycle. Transience is beneficial if we don't flee it, if we stay flexible, and if we embrace it. Thanks for giving me your time.